Hello and welcome back to Rock Records Reviewed. My name's Adam, and this week we're going to take a look at the top 10 albums by American rock giants Aerosmith. So Aerosmith formed in Boston in 1970, pretty much an amalgamation of two other bands, Joe Perry's The Jam Band and Steve Tyler's Chain Reaction, in which, funnily enough, he played the drums. When they formed Aerosmith, they were augmented by Brad Whitford on guitar, Tom Hamilton on bass, and Joey Kramer on drums. And they started out very much as a bit of a sort of Stones, Zeppelin influenced blues-based rock band before they got a deal with Columbia in 1972 and went on to become known as America's greatest rock and roll band. I mean, undoubtedly one of America's greatest rock and roll bands, I think. They're often seen as the American Rolling Stones, I think owing much to the dynamic between Steve Tyler and Joe Perry, who bill themselves as the Toxic Twins, which is an appropriate name because it has to be said that drug abuse does play quite a large part in their story, and there's arguably a large swathe of their music, I think, that has suffered because of it. I think there are three phases of Aerosmith. There's the first phase where the early years that sort of put them on the map. Then there is this second phase, the drug-fueled mid-period, where they lost their way quite a bit and nearly imploded. And then you have this sort of phoenix-like comeback in their third phase, where they conquered America's arenas with a sort of a bigger sound than ever and collecting bigger paychecks than ever. Now I think there's something at American Institution, and sort of despite the fractious relationship between Tyler and Perry, they still managed to wheel themselves out for the odd world tour, and they managed to make an album every 10 years or so. In total, they've made 15 studio albums, and I don't mind telling you that some of them I think are pretty poor. Some due to a kind of drug-fueled aimlessness, and others perhaps maybe more due to a sort of rich, unambitious rock star's lack of inspiration. But a handful of them I think are great, and I think today we're going to take a look at the top 10, so let's crack into it. At number 10 I am going to put from 1985 their 8th album, Done With Mirrors. Now this is not a great record, but I think it's a significant one because it marks the return of the prodigal guitarists Joe Perry, who'd left the band in 1979, and Whitford, who'd left in 1981. It's also their first album for Geffen, and as such I think it's very much a sort of rebirth after years of chemical abuse diminishing their music. In fact, the record was recorded in Berkeley instead of LA, so it would be harder for the band to score drugs. That's kind of what a situation they'd got themselves into. Producer Ted Templeman, he would press record in the studio room without the band knowing, hoping to try and get a much kind of looser feel, sort of a much easier flow to the music, and the performances much less uptight than the band had been before. And I think in the album, it's an album that should work, but it never really quite takes off. It's kind of, in a funny way, it's a remarkable, unremarkable record. It's remarkable that it ever got made, but there isn't really a great deal on here to celebrate. The best track is arguably the re-recording of Joe Perry's solo track, Let the Music Do the Talking. Perry has called it one of the band's most uninspired records, but it did get sort of fairly favourable reviews from the press when it came out, which is kind of a bit odd for Aerosmith at the time, and many fans are very, very fond of it. Interestingly, it's the last album the band made without the help of outside songwriters. It went gold in the USA, which was actually a very, very poor comparison to past albums, but also a very poor comparison to what was to come afterwards. And number 9 from 1979, I'm going to put their 6th album, Night in the Ruts. By the late 70s, the band was really spiralling out of control. Financially, they were hemorrhaging money. Joe Perry alone owed $80,000 for room service. And the drug use was just ripping the relationships apart, so much so that longtime producer Jack Douglas never even turned up for the sessions for this album, and Joe Perry quit halfway through the sessions after falling out with Tyler, who he felt was not pulling his weight writing lyrics and doing vocals. Perry plays on only 6 of the tracks here, and 2 session men came in to replace him, but the miracle, I think, is actually that the album's not a stinker. In fact, there are a couple of good Aerosmith tracks on here, like the opener No Surprise, and 3 Mile Smile. The critics hated it, of course, and they saw it as the start of the band's death rattle. And it only went 1 times platinum in the States, which was their worst selling album to date at that point. At number 8, I'm going to put the band's 11th album from 1993, Get a Grip. I'm not, cards on the table, I'm not a huge fan of post-1970s Aerosmith. In some ways it feels to me like they saw the big payday by playing to the masses and writing arena-sized plod rock. And for me, they seem to have lost all the insouciance and devil-may-care attitude that made them so appealing in the first place. And this album is another sufferer of CD-itis, and all you regular watchers will know exactly what I mean by that. It's 15 tracks long, much of it is quite a slog. But, when they do get a grip on this album, I do hear riffs, I hear hooks, I hear almost a very un-Aerosmith-like concern for the world around them. On many tracks, it feels like they're imploring the world itself to get a grip. You've got some big hits on here, Crying and Amazing, and miraculously they seem to be fighting grunge off with a healthy blast of stadium rock. Don Henley and Lenny Kravitz appear as guests on the album, and it became the band's biggest seller worldwide, selling more than 20 million copies. And it was their first #1 album as well in the States. And it also won 2 Grammys. And I think the critics were a little bit divided between those who felt that the band was kind of admirably fighting off grunge music and Nirvana and slacker grunge rock. And others who felt that they were sort of turning into a kind of Bon Jovi type of band. But it was the last album they made for Geffen before returning to Columbia as well. At number 7, I'm going to put from 1987, their 9th album, Permanent Vacation. This is the album that really did seal the band's comeback. If Done with Mirrors was the kind of kiss of life, then this album was the actual reawakening, I think. And, yes, the band is propped up by a load of co-songwriters and studio bods. That was not uncommon in the third period at all. And yes, it does have an enormo kind of drum 80s sound to it. But, you all know Dude looks like... You all know it, even if you can't say it. You all know Dude Looks Like a Lady and Angel and Ragdoll and hits like that. As well as sort of neat tracks like Hangman, Jury and St. John. It's not their most likeable album by any stretch. A lot of that's due to the production, I think. But to ignore its crucial role in Aerosmith Part 3, I think would be a bit of a criminal oversight. Producer Bruce Fairbairn brought a glossy kind of MTV-like sheen to the sound that appealed also to the UK for the first time as well, this being their first album to attain silver and gold status on this side of the pond. Possibly helped by a really good cover of the Beatles' I'm Down. It went 5 times platinum in the USA, and at this point there was no question that Aerosmith were back on the map, or back in the saddle. At number 6, from 1977, their 5th album, Draw the Line. Now, I think, this is the point where the Aerosmith story starts getting a little bit messy and druggy. By now, the lifestyle was starting to take its toll, and you can almost hear the burnout on the grooves of this album. The band sounds jaded and a bit exhausted, and even a little bit disinterested. Joe Perry has even said by this time they were drug users dabbling in music rather than musicians dabbling in drugs. The riffs are just maybe that little bit more predictable. There are good moments and they can still hold your attention, like on the title track, Critical Mass, The Hand That Feeds. They're all pretty enjoyable. But I don't think any of those songs would have got anywhere near their best albums. Robert Christgau said it was the sound of a band out of gas. I think, though, funny things, time's been a little bit kinder to it, hence its highish ranking here. Although it went 2 times platinum, it was clear that the band's reputation and sales were in decline by 1977. So let's get to the top 5. And at number 5, I'm going to put their 10th album from 1989, Pump. In many ways, this is the band's most popular album in that it's the album that sold the fastest. It had 3 huge hits on it. It's a big, loud, brash record in that kind of horrible 80s way. It's chock full of hits. Love in an Elevator, Janie's Got a Gun. Now on the album they did want it to be a lot leaner and tighter than the sound was on Permanent Vacation, and to a degree it is, but I'm just still not a fan of that bloody drum sound. At 47 minutes long, it just about doesn't outstay its welcome. And by now, Aerosmith was sort of vying with Guns N' Roses as being sort of the biggest rock band on the planet. And this album, to me, feels like the album where they really became part of the establishment. Their third phase now had really truly taken flight. They were having loads of hits. This was their first album to win a Grammy. And I think with their sort of drugs to riches story and with their celebrity kids, Perry and Tyler had sort of become newspaper column, society page regulars, very much by now the Mick and Keith of American music. This was overall the fourth biggest selling album in 1990 as well. It went 7 times platinum in the USA. Impressive figures. But for me, I think it's these top 4 albums that I really like about Aerosmith. And at number 4, I'm going to put their debut from 1973. And as debuts go, this is a bit of a peach, called Aerosmith. On this, the band, they swing and they swagger with much, much likability. I like the sparse, dry production, even if the band have gone on record saying they don't. And it sounds like a band with a lot of confidence dripping from their sort of glittery bell bottoms. That doesn't quite come out right, but you know what I meant. But apparently that wasn't the case. Apparently they were all very, very uptight and nervous about being in the studio for the first time. It's still full of neat guitar licks and hooks, and it's very enjoyable rock and roll. There's a decent cover of Rufus Thomas's Walking the Dog on here, and of course the highlight is Dream On, on which to this day I think remains their sort of most epic song. And probably the song that really made them. And although it only got to number 59 in the national charts at the time, it very quickly became a staple of American rock radio. As an album, it was pretty much ignored at the time, but eventually went 2 times platinum. And as one reviewer said, the best bar band in town had finally arrived. At number 3, their second album, Get Your Wings, from 1974. Now, as sophomore albums go, this one is also a winner. It marks the start of the band's relationship with longtime producer Jack Douglas. And he gives us more of the same. It's like a lot of second albums. It's kind of more of the same, but it's just a bit tighter. It's a bit slicker. It's turned up a little bit. Again, recorded at the record plant in New York. It's a short, tight 8-track album. Just lasts under 40 minutes. And yes, the band is helped here and there out by some session players, but you still have some all-time prime Aerosmith cuts here, like the brilliant Same Old Song and Dance, and the ridiculous but fun kind of Lord of the Thighs. And that title, by the way, signalling the start of the band's lifelong obsession lyrically with smut and sleaze, or slut and smeeze. They keep playing their blues dues with a cracking cover of The Train Kept A-Rolling, went 3 times platinum in the USA, and was pretty well received at the time by the critics, who called it derivative but fun, which I think says it all. But it's these top 2 albums, I think, that really cemented Aerosmith's place in the sort of greats, even by the time the 70s were over. And a lot of Aerosmith fans argue about which of these 2 albums should be at the top, which one shouldn't be. And often I'll say, either of album could be at the top for me, but I'm pretty set in which of these albums I think is better. So number 2, I'm going to put their 4th album from 1976, Rocks. The band was now in full flow, with pretty much every member at the top of their game and bringing something really, really important to the table, something really worthwhile. Again, recorded in the record plant with Jack Douglas, there's a real growing influence on this album from Whitford and Hamilton, and that's possibly a good thing, I think, because this marks the point at which Tyler and Perry admitted their drug use was by now on the rise. Opening with the iconic Back in the Saddle, You've also got Last Child, Rats in the Cellar, Sick as a Dog. And this album it swings and it rocks like the best rock and roll albums do. And what I mean by that is that you can turn it up to 11 without getting a headache. And you're still humming the tunes, a few hours later. I think it's a cracking record, but it does, for me, tend a bit to sound like its predecessor, Part 2, which we'll talk about more in a minute. And I think that's really exactly what it was. If it wasn't broke by this point, why fix it? 4 times platinum in the USA, 366 on Rolling Stone's greatest albums of all time, and regarded by many as their landmark album. And it was certainly a huge influence on many, many bands to come. Nirvana, Metallica, Guns N' Roses, Motley Crue, you name it. They all have openly acknowledged their debt to this record. But let's get to number 1, which I'm sure you've guessed it by now, is their third album from 1975, Toys in the Attic. Now, for my money, this is the best Aerosmith album. This is where they really found their sound and their groove in a way that they've never bettered. I think it's their most consistent album. And I think one of the reasons for that is that the band had been touring really, really solidly just prior to this album. And they'd become noticeably better players by the time they got back to the record plant to record this with Jack Douglas again. Also, this was the first time they'd written all the songs from scratch, and as such, the arrangements, I think, are a little bit more interesting here. It has, of course, Walk This Way on it, as well as Sweet Emotion, which I think is arguably their best song and their best recording. And the whole album, it's loose, it's fun. I'll even let them get away with their silly cover of Big 10-inch Record, which is every inch as smutty as you'd expect. But other great tracks on here include Uncle Salty, which Shania Twain ripped off almost note for note for one of her big hits. Adam's Apple, which hits every push and pull perfectly. And as one band member said in later liner notes, this was really where they felt they nailed the album making process. And I totally agree. The reviews, as always with Aerosmith, were kind of mixed, but I doubt they gave 2 hoots because this album went 9 times platinum in the USA. It was their biggest seller they ever had on their home soil, and 228 on Rolling Stone's greatest albums of all time. And Walk This Way made it into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as one of the 100 songs that shaped rock and roll. And as I've said, I think if you're, that's my top 10. I think if you're new to Aerosmith, looking to investigate, I would say you don't really need to go any further than the top 2 here. But if you're not scared of 80s production, and you should be, then you could probably check out Pump as well, I think. It's also worth mentioning, of course, about Aerosmith that they did have an enormous worldwide hit with their re-recording of Walk This Way in collaboration with Run DMC. And that was an absolute landmark, a crucial recording that really brought both rock and rap to whole new audiences in that nice synergetic way, and in many ways created a whole new genre of its own called rock rap or rap rock, whatever. The band made their last album, Music from Another Dimension, in 2012, and it was okay. Will we ever see another Aerosmith album? I guess we might, but times have not only changed, but times are running out, and Tyler and Perry still famously grapple a little bit, and they're still no strangers to rehab, sadly. So don't hold your breath. But look, that's my top 10 Aerosmith albums. I know there are a lot of diehard Aerosmith fans out there who probably despise me at this point for some of my negative comments, and that's fine. You can put your hate and anger in the comments below, but do it with peace and love if you can, as Ringo would say. I hope you enjoyed that. Let me know what you think, and I will see you for another episode of Rock Records Review very soon. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.